Hello everybody. In this presentation I want to cover the basics of PlayMaker and get you up and running with some of the basic concepts in PlayMaker. At this point I'll assume that you've downloaded PlayMaker either through the asset store or from the developer's website. And when I'm inside Unity I have this PlayMaker drop-down menu. Once you install PlayMaker you'll have access to that drop-down menu. And you'll see that I have the PlayMaker editor nested to the right of my assets. That allows me to focus on both assets and PlayMaker. And I can get to that window by choosing PlayMaker Editor. That's this window here, and again I just nested it right to the right of my project panel, and that's simply just by grabbing the tab and dragging and snapping it to wherever you want in the interface. In addition to that, I went to PlayMaker Editor's window, Action Browser, and I've nested the Action Browser over here to the right next to my inspector panel inside Unity. Once I've done that, I've also chose to save this layout so that if I accidentally close things or move things around and I want to snap it back, I can just choose my PlayMaker layout. So at this point I have a real simple scene set up. I have a cube that I've established as my ground plane, and I've named it ground, and it's at the 0, 0, 0 is at the origin of the 3D space. Its scale is 30 along the X and 5 along the Z. I also have a cube object that's named player, and that's nothing more than just a standard cube that I've changed the name. In addition to that, I have a basic directional light, and I've taken its intensity down a little bit just so that we can see the effects of this point light that I've introduced. That's just a blue light, something kind of dramatic. And in fact, I think I'm going to change it. My sky, or my default background, is blue, so I'll change this to red so it's even a little bit more dramatic. So this is the basic scenario that I have set up, and I'll use this scenario just to kind of explore some of the basic capabilities of PlayMaker, and then also transition into our first project with PlayMaker, our greeting card game project. And we'll use we'll try to replicate some basic mechanics that are in some popular games that are found in the iOS and Google Play Store. But for now, let's jump into PlayMaker. Now, the way that PlayMaker works is it allows you to create functional state machines, or I'll refer to these as state machines or just machines. And these are little visual kind of flowchart machines that we can create and will allow us to avoid scripting. So this is often referred to as kind of a visual scripting environment, and it's very intuitive. And the way that we'll get started is that just like attaching scripts to objects, we want to choose an object that we can attach components to. Now I'm going to grab the player object, and I want to build just a real simple state machine, and I'll just right click and I'll choose to add FSM. Now there's a couple of different things that I can do, but the first thing that I want to do is just add that first state. And we see this little start indicator here, and that's just telling us which state we're starting in. Now I can right click and add multiple states, and we can connect these states based on events. So we can listen for actions, and based on user input or environmental input, we can determine which state we want to go to from one state to the next. Now these states allow us to modify game objects, game environment, listen for other kinds of input, or do specific things inside our environment. So we can have as many states as we want, and we can kind of connect these together based on conditions. So we're basically doing some visual programming here, and it allows us to apply logic without getting caught up in syntax. So it's a really powerful tool. Now I'm going to delete state 3. Just right click on it and choose to delete states. So our states are the things that allow us to modify content inside our game object, or inside our game environment, excuse me. But in order to have events connect to each other, or excuse me, in order to have states connect to each other, it has to be event driven, or driven by events. And so we're going to want to establish a couple of different events, or maybe just one event, that when something happens, it gets sent by that event to another state. So I have a basic state machine established here, and you can see that if I look in the hierarchy panel, we have this icon that pops up, and that's just telling us that there's a state machine that's attached to the player object. And when this object is born, whatever this state machine is going to run. And right now we start in state 1. And what we can do is if we select state 1, we can go over here to our actions panel, and I'm going to just go into input, and we can listen for some player input. Now I'll just do some real simple player input, and I'm listening for a get key down. So if I select get key down, you'll notice that anytime you select an action, there's a little preview of the action here. It tells you what it does and what some of the parameters are. And if I double click on that, you'll see that that action pops up in this state. So you can see that I have a specific state selected. I have my state tab revealed here. So this is showing us the contents of this state. And if I double click on get key down, you can see that it loads that action. And what this can do is it's going to listen for a get key down, and we'll choose which key we want to listen for. And you can see that if I scroll way down, all the keys of the keyboard are represented here. And if I go up to the top, you can see that the space bar is listed there, so I'm listening for the space bar. And once that's true, once the space bar has been pressed, we need to send it off to an event. And currently we don't have any events. Okay, and that's where we get into either choosing some system events or building our own custom events. And so we can think of events, and I'll just jump over to the events tab. We can think of events as just little tags, little labels that remind us when we get some kind of user input or some kind of condition where that's going to send, which state that's going to send it to. And so what I'll do is I'll go down to where it says add event. There's a field here, and I'll just call this event space has been pressed. Now normally I don't name these so long, and I'm a little bit more efficient with the names, but it's being pressed there. I'll correct that. Space has been pressed. And so now we have an event. Now events are attached to states as transitions. Now this can be the most abstract concept here, I think, when it comes to state machines, is that in most cases we're going to create a list of events, and those events are just like kind of like road signs as to where we're going to go when certain actions have been executed. So I'm going to go back to my state tab, which shows me what actions are assigned to the state. And in state 1, it's listening for a get key down, it's listening for space, and once space has been pressed, we want to send it to an event. And so if I click on the events, now any event that I've created is available in this drop-down menu. So currently we're listening for the space bar. When the space has been pressed, it's going to send us to the space has been pressed event. So the next step is that we have to add that event as a transition from one state to the next. And you can see there's a little exclamation point here. PlayMaker is very good about letting us know that we're missing some information here. So the way that setting up a state machine works is that we have our initial state, we've created an event and an action, so we're listening for a specific action. I'm going to right click on this event, and I need to add a transition which will give me the opportunity to connect one state to another. And I'm going to choose add transition, and you can see that the event that I've created is listed here. So if I had more events, I'd have a bigger list. We also have custom and system events here, and we're going to ignore these for now. We're just going to choose our own events that we've made. And once I choose that, you can see that I now have a transition point here. Now, we can have a big list of different transitions that, based on different kinds of input, whether it's keyboard or environmental input, we can send things off to different states, and you'll see that here shortly. But for now, I want to keep it really simple. So if I select state 1, what's happening is we're listening for space, the space bar to be pressed, and when that happens, we want to fire off this event of space has been pressed. And that space has been pressed, we want to tell this event where to go. Now remember, we can have multiple states. We could have state 2 and 3, and I want to tell what event or what state we want to end up in when this event happens. And so I'm going to click on and drag, and that creates a wire, and I'm going to connect it to the next state. So state 1, when the space bar is pressed, it's going to move it over to state 2. Now once we have that scenario established, I can test this. And I can test this by hitting the play button and looking down here at the state machine, and this will allow us to debug it. If I hit the space bar, you can see that we're in state 1, that's why it's highlighted here. And when I hit the space bar, you can see that it fires off and sends us to state 2, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so this player, this player object, is sitting here in state 1 until we press the spacebar, which takes us to state 2. Now, for now, I don't really need a state 3, so I'm just going to right-click on that and hit delete state. What I want to do is when I press the spacebar, I want to send this cube up into the air. So I want to apply a force to it. Now, in order to apply force, if you remember back in previous projects, we always had to apply a rigid body to an object that we want to apply force to. And so just like we've done previously, what I want to do is with my player object, I'm going to go to Component, Physics, and make sure that there's a rigid body that's assigned to that player. So now, if I lift this player object up and I just hit play, you'll see that the cube falls to the ground. So it's being affected by the Unity physics engine. It has a rigid body assigned to it. With that object selected, we can go inspect its rigid body properties, but I'm going to let everything default. Now what I want to do is when I hit the space bar and we send it over to state 2, with state 2 selected, what I want to do is I want to add an action that applies a force up on this object. And the way that I'll do that, I'll just close this input here. I'm going to go all the way down to the physics tab. And when I reveal the physics tab, you can see this is all the stuff that I can do with physics. And I'm just looking for a real simple add force. Now I have state 2 selected, and I'll double click, and that loads add force into state 2. So in other words, when this machine is in state 2, it's adding force to the owner of this object, and then we'll determine what parameters and how we want to apply that force. So what I'm going to do is in the y-axis, you can see it says none. I want to apply a y force to it. So we're going to push from the bottom, we're going to move it up along the y-axis. And I don't want to use a variable, which is why it says none, and there's a drop-down menu here. I don't want to use a variable here. What I want to do is I want to use just a straight number. And so if I click on this little button over here, you can see that that turns into a 0. And I can input any value that I want here. So I'll just apply, let's say 20. So I'm going to apply a force of 20 to this object along the y-axis when it's in this state. So in other words, if I hit play, and I look down here to debug this, when I press the spacebar, it applies a force to this object. Now that either wasn't enough force or there's something else going on with my object, so I need to take a quick look at that. Now, if I go back over to state 2 and I continue to look at some of the parameters, the game object that we're applying force to is the owner of this object, which means whatever this state machine is attached to, which is the player. That's good. If we wanted to, we could talk to other objects and say, no, don't move the player, move some other object, but that's a little outside the scope of this introduction. At which point we don't want to do an at position or at vector. We want to apply it simply at the y-axis. We want to apply it according to the world space. The alternative would be the self space. And the big difference between world and self is that the world has a y-axis that is always pointing up. Currently, our player is pointing up as well, but in the event that, that our object were to rotate a bit and we were applying force not to the world, but to itself, it would travel in its y direction. So in this scenario, the world axis is going straight up and down, but its self y-axis is kind of leaning off to the right here. So I want to make sure in this scenario that I'm using the y-axis in the world, and I'll just kind of straighten out my rotation here. I'll type back in 0. So everything there looks good. The force mode that we're applying by default is force, and some of our other options include impulse and velocity change, but I think I'm going to go with force. Now, the reason nothing is happening is because when I hit the play button and I tap the space bar, it applies force, but it applies force for just one frame. So it's just a little blip. It happens really quickly, and that's not enough force to generate any kind of movement on this object. But what we can do is say that every frame, so every time the frame redraws or refreshes in our 3D environment, make sure to add this force to it. So now when I hit play and I tap the spacebar, you can see that my cube lifts up and flies out of the scene. So again, the basic concept here is that I have a start state that is doing nothing but sitting and listening for some keyboard or some user input. when that specific input that we asked to listen to has been met, it sends an event that we've created. The event provides a transition from one state to another, and in our second state, we're applying a force to the owner of the object along the y-axis in the world space every frame that this is active. Now what we could do is when I hit the play button and I hit space, we got a bug in our design in that our cube just launches, and you can see that it's continuing to move and it won't stop moving because we're stuck in state 2. So what we could do is we'll go to events and we'll create an action, and I'll simply call this reset. I can call this anything that I want, but to me it kind of makes sense to call it a reset, so that we'll reset back to state 1. With state 2 selected, this is where we're adding force. I'm going to right click and add a transition. I don't want to add space has been pressed, although technically I could use this event, but it won't visually make a lot of sense. So I'm going to use this reset that I've created, and I'll just connect that back to state 1. So in other words, when state 2 is being reset, we can go back to state 1. Now we'll see that there's a little glitch here, because when I press the space bar down, it fires over to state 2, and there's nothing calling that reset event. There's nothing that's happening here that's allowing for that reset event to go back. Now there's a couple of different ways that we could handle this. One is that we could listen for that same keyboard input that we listened to before on state 2, but instead of get key down, we can choose get key up, and I'll just apply a get key up. The key that we're listening for is the space bar. The send event is not space has been pressed, because that has nothing to do with state 2 at this point. We want to choose the reset, and I'll ignore this store event. So now what I have is a scenario that when the space bar is down, it's in state 2, and when it's released, it goes back to state 1, which drops this. So now we have a scenario where we have this kind of basic thrusting mechanic, whereas if I hold down the space bar, force is being applied, and when I release, it's letting up. So that's kind of the basic overview of how to implement a PlayMaker functional state machine, or excuse me, finite state machine, and we'll create some more complex scenarios here in the near future. So we'll catch up in the next presentation and make a little bit more complex user input, and we'll start to build some components into our game. We'll do that in the next presentation.